In the spring of 2011, the Buffalo Sabres did something quietly unusual. Behind each goal, on the ice of what was then called HSBC Arena, the number 7 appeared, and it stayed there for the rest of the 2010 to 2011 season. Every time a puck crossed that line, every time a goalie dropped to his knees, that number was right there in the paint, watching. It was a tribute to a man who had just passed away at 59 years old. And here is the strange part. The man being honored had never lifted the Stanley Cup. He had never received a call from the Hockey Hall of Fame. His career, by the cold math of the record book, was over before he turned 31. And yet, an entire city was in mourning.
His name was Richard Lionel Martin, though almost nobody called him Richard. To Buffalo, he was Rick, the deadly left wing of a line they still talk about in reverent tones decades later. Across 11 NHL seasons, he played 685 games, scored 384 goals, and put up 701 points. Those are very good numbers. But numbers alone do not explain why grown men in Western New York went silent when the news came. So here is the central mystery of this story. How does a player who never won a championship, who never entered hockey's most exclusive hall, whose prime was cut down in a single violent instant, somehow feel bigger in Buffalo than almost any name in the national record book? The answer lives in 3 shocks. A breakaway in 1980 that ended everything. A trade just weeks later that sent him out the door. And a medical finding in 2011 after his passing that turned one hockey tragedy into a warning the entire sport could not ignore.
But to understand why a whole city grieved a man who never raised hockey's greatest trophy, we have to go back to a draft day in 1971 and to the moment Buffalo gambled on a young French-Canadian sniper barely out of his teens. Rick Martin was born on the 26th of July, 1951. He came up the way so many great Quebec scorers did, through the junior ranks, sharpening his game with the Montreal Junior Canadiens of the Ontario Hockey Association. He was a left wing with a shot that made coaches lean forward, the kind of player whose release looked just a little faster than everyone else's. Now picture the team that came calling. The Buffalo Sabres in 1971 were barely a team at all. They were an expansion club, only a year old, still searching for an identity, still searching for stars, still trying to convince a hard-nosed hockey town that they belonged in the National Hockey League. A franchise like that does not draft for the future. It drafts for survival. It drafts for somebody who can put fans in the seats and pucks in the net. And it needs that somebody to arrive almost immediately. So with the 5th overall pick of the 1971 NHL Amateur Draft, Buffalo took the kid from the Montreal Junior Canadiens, Rick Martin. Think about the weight of that. A young, unproven goal scorer handed the hopes of a struggling organization before he had played a single NHL shift. There was no veteran core to hide behind, no dynasty to be slowly folded into. In a 2-year-old franchise, a high pick is not a luxury. He is the plan. And that kind of pressure either crushes a young player or forges him into something the city will never forget. Buffalo did not yet know it, but that 5th pick was about to combine with 2 other names to create one of the most feared trios the sport had ever seen, a line that would earn a nickname borrowed straight from the movies. It did not take long for the pieces to find each other. On the left wing, Rick Martin. In the middle, the silky, dazzling Gilbert Perreault, already the face of the young franchise. And on the right side, René Robert, a winger with grit and finish. 3 French Canadians, 3 distinct styles, one shared instinct for where the puck was about to go. They called it the French Connection, the nickname borrowed from a popular film of the era. But in Buffalo, it came to mean something far more specific. It meant a line that could turn a single rush into a goal before the other team had finished changing. It meant an expansion club, almost overnight, becoming a genuinely feared offensive machine. Fans did not just watch the Sabres anymore. They watched that line, waiting for the moment all three men clicked into gear at once. Within that trio, Martin had a job that was all his own. He was not the passer. He was not the setup man weaving through traffic. He was the finisher. The sniper. The one whose shot ended the play and lit the lamp. Perreault created the chaos. Robert worked the corners. And Martin sat in the spots where goals are scored, waiting to do the one thing he did better than almost anyone. The recognition came fast, and it kept coming. Martin was selected to play in 7 consecutive All-Star games, from the 1971-72 season all the way through 1977-78. 7 years in a row among the best in the world. For a player drafted by a franchise that barely existed, it was a stunning rise. And from 1973 onward, that shot would make Martin not just a fan favorite, but one of the most lethal goal scorers in the entire National Hockey League, a man the record books were forced to notice. The breakout came in the 1973-74 season, and it was no fluke. Martin was named a first-team NHL All-Star at left wing, the highest honor at his position, and he finished second in the entire league in goals that year. Second. In a league stacked with legends, the kid Buffalo had gambled on was now one of the 2 most productive goal scorers in the sport. What made it real, what separated Martin from the one-year wonders, was that he kept doing it. He finished in the top 10 in goals in 5 different seasons, in 1971-72, then again in 73-74, 74-75, 75-76, and 76-77. That is not a hot streak. That is a half-decade of sustained elite dominance, the kind that builds a reputation around the league and a fear in opposing goaltenders. So what made him different? It came down to the release and the instincts. A pure scorer does not chase the puck. He goes to the place the puck is about to arrive, and he gets his shot off before the defense can react. Teammates respected the threat he carried every single shift, because a defenseman who lost track of Martin for half a second often paid for it with a red light. He did not need 10 chances. He needed 1. By the mid-1970s, Rick Martin was no longer the expansion club's hopeful gamble. He was a star, a perennial all-star, and one of the deadliest finishers alive. But everything that made Martin great was about to crystallize into one single, almost untouchable season, the year he nearly scored a goal for every game he played. The season was 1974-75, and it remains the version of Rick Martin that Buffalo argues about to this day. In just 68 games, he scored 52 goals and put up 95 points. Read that again, slowly. 52 goals in 68 games. That is production so dense, so relentless, that it placed him among the most prolific goal scorers per game in NHL history. This was the high watermark, the full power of the sniper at his absolute best. When older Sabres fans get into the eternal barroom debate about who the greatest Sabre of all time really was, this is the season they reach for. Not a career total, not a longevity argument, but this one electric year when the puck seemed to find the net every time Martin touched it. He was around 23 years old, in the heart of his prime, and there was no obvious ceiling in sight. And that is exactly where this story begins to ache. Because if this was prime Rick Martin, a man capable of more than 50 goals in fewer than 70 games, then the question that haunts the rest of this film is unavoidable. What did Buffalo lose when that prime was taken away? Not faded, not declined gradually with age, but taken in a single violent instant on home ice. The records he set, the banners that would one day hang, all of it would be measured against a career that the body simply would not allow to finish. That same spring, the French connection carried Buffalo somewhere the franchise had never been, one series away from hockey immortality. The spring of 1975 belonged to Buffalo. The French connection was humming at full speed. The building was electric, and a franchise that had existed for only 5 years suddenly found itself playing for the biggest prize in the sport. The Sabres reached the 1975 Stanley Cup Finals, and for a young club still finding its footing, it was the closest brush with immortality the group would ever know. Think about how fast it had all happened. A handful of years earlier, this was an expansion team scrapping for credibility, drafting a teenage sniper out of Montreal and hoping he could carry the load. Now that same sniper was on a line feared across the league, and his team was 4 wins from the cup. The city believed. You could feel it. There is a particular kind of hope that lives in a hockey town when its team peaks young, a sense that the window has just opened and will stay open for years. But Buffalo did not win. The finals slipped away, and the cup went elsewhere. And here is the cruel arithmetic that shadows the rest of Rick Martin's story. Across 11 NHL seasons, he never won a Stanley Cup. That 1975 run would stand as the only finals appearance of his entire career. At the time, no one treated it as a last chance. Why would they? The team was young, the stars were in their prime, and the future looked endless. That is the ache at the center of this chapter. The window that felt so wide open in 1975 never opened that wide again. What Buffalo might have become, with that line intact and healthy for another 5 or 6 seasons, is one of the great unanswerable questions in the franchise's history. The group was good enough to get there once. They simply never got back. He never got his cup. But 1 year later, on the international stage, Martin would finally taste victory in the colors of his country. If the Stanley Cup was the prize that always stayed just out of reach, 1976 offered Rick Martin something close to redemption. He was named to the Team Canada roster for the Canada Cup, an international tournament that gathered the very best players the country had to offer, and Canada won it. For Martin, it was the championship he could actually point to, even if it was not the one every Canadian boy dreams about as a child. Understand what that selection said about him. Canada, in the mid-1970s, was overflowing with talent. A nation so deep in elite hockey players that being left off the roster was no insult at all. To make that team, you had to be judged among the country's finest. Martin made it. The expansion gamble from 1971 was now, by national consensus, one of the best players Canada could send to face the world. And the individual honors kept arriving alongside the team glory. After his first team All-Star selections earlier in the decade, Martin was named to the NHL's second team at left wing in both 1975-76 and 1976-77. Year after year, the league was telling everyone the same thing. This man belonged among the elite at his position, and it was not close. But there is a bittersweet edge to it all. International glory in 1976 sits right next to the unfinished ache of his NHL story. The cup he never lifted, the prime that still seemed to stretch out ahead of him. From the outside, this looked like a player with everything in front of him. Martin seemed untouchable, at the peak of his powers, an all-star year after year. And then, on a February night in 1978,
A single play turned out the lights inside his head. It was the 9th of February, 1978. The Sabres were winning at home, on their way to a 2-0 victory, and there was nothing about the night that warned anyone of its importance. Then, midway through the third period, came a play that the record book filed away quietly, but that would echo for decades. Dave Farish of the New York Rangers hooked Martin around the neck from behind and kicked his feet out from under him. Martin went down hard, his head striking the ice. He was knocked unconscious. He began to convulse. For the players and the crowd watching it unfold, it was a frightening sight. The kind of moment where a building goes silent all at once. Now, remember the era. This was a time when many of the game's biggest stars still played with nothing on their heads. Rick Martin, like so much of his generation, spent most of his career without a helmet. The skull took the hit the ice delivered, with no padding in between. It is telling that after this very play, helmets became a far more common sight on the heads of his Sabre teammates. Men who had skated bareheaded for years began to reconsider. And here is where the story plants a seed that will not bloom for decades, and it must be handled with care. Researchers would one day point to this 1978 concussion as a contributing factor in something far more serious. But they would also be careful to say it was not the sole cause. His years of playing without a helmet, they noted, likely exposed him to many other blows along the way, blows no one counted at the time. This single night was a piece of a much larger puzzle, one that would not be assembled until long after Martin was gone. Martin recovered. He kept scoring, but his body had begun keeping a record of every blow, and the next one, 2 years later, would not let him walk away. The date was the 8th of November, 1980. The place was the Odd, Buffalo's beloved old barn, and the opponent was the Washington Capitals. What happened over the next few seconds would change the trajectory of Rick Martin's career, and arguably the franchise's history, in ways no one in the building could have understood as it occurred. Martin was racing in on a breakaway, the very situation that had made him famous. The open ice, the goalie alone, the sniper bearing down. Then it all came apart. Capitals forward Ryan Walter managed to trip him. And here is the detail that still stings in Buffalo all these years later. No penalty was called. None. On a play that would effectively end one of the era's great scoring careers, the officials kept their arms down. But the trip was only the beginning. Capitals goaltender Mike Palmateer, already well out of his crease, knocked Martin back down by kicking his knee. The result was severe cartilage damage, the kind of structural destruction that does not simply heal with rest and patience. The injury kept Martin out of all but 11 games for the remainder of that season. The breakaway specialist, the man whose legs and instincts had carried him to 50-goal seasons, had his knee taken out from under him on a play the officials decided was nothing at all. There is no way to dress that up gently. One of the most lethal finishers of his generation, a 7-time All-Star, a Canada Cup champion, had his career broken on a sequence that went into the books as a routine bit of hockey. No whistle, no record, just a knee, and everything that followed. But the knee was only the first wound. The second came from his own organization, and Martin would spend years blaming one of hockey's most famous coaches for what happened next. After the breakaway disaster, Rick Martin went to Toronto for surgery on the wrecked knee. But surgery is only the beginning of the story. What comes next, the rehabilitation, the slow rebuilding of a joint that has been torn apart, that is where careers are either saved or lost. And in Martin's own telling, this is where things went badly wrong. He later said that his knee was almost completely ruined by the fall of 1981. He said he feared being unable to walk if he kept playing on it, and he placed the blame squarely on one man. Martin blamed Scotty Bowman, then running the Sabres, for pressing him to suit up in January of 1981, before the knee was anywhere near ready. According to Martin, that premature return hindered his rehabilitation, doing further damage to a joint that needed time it was never given.
It is important to be clear about the source here. This is Martin's account, his version of events, his sense of grievance about how the end of his Buffalo career was handled. And the end came fast. On the 10th of March, 1981, Bowman traded Martin and Don Luce to the Los Angeles Kings for a pair of draft picks. Just like that, the sniper who had carried an expansion franchise to the edge of glory was gone, shipped west for futures. Here is where the story turns bitterly ironic. One of those draft picks would eventually be used in 1983 to select a goaltender named Tom Barrasso, a player who would become a genuine star and a cornerstone for Buffalo.
So Martin's departure, the painful close of his time with the Sabres, was tied directly to the franchise's future success. The man who felt cast aside became, in the cold ledger of hockey transactions, the price of someone else's arrival. In Los Angeles, the great Buffalo sniper would play just 4 more games before quietly admitting the truth, that the legs that made him famous would carry him no further.
There is something almost unbearable about how Rick Martin's playing career actually ended. No farewell tour, no standing ovation in the building that loved him.
Just 4 games as a member of the Los Angeles Kings, 3 time zones away from Western New York, before he hung up the skates for good in December of 1981. Think about the contrast. This was a man who had once scored more than 50 goals in fewer than 70 games, a finisher so feared that defensemen lost sleep over him. And the curtain came down not in a roar, but in near silence, on a ruined knee, in a city that had never watched him in his prime. The deadliest scorer of his generation simply faded out, quietly, far from home. There was no dramatic last goal that anyone speaks of, no signature exit. The body had finally refused, and Martin had the honesty to listen to it.
When it was all over, the career totals froze in place, and they tell their own story. 685 NHL games, 384 goals, 317 assists, 701 points. Those are the numbers of a very fine career. But every Buffalo fan who watched him knows the cruel truth hiding inside them. These were the numbers of a career interrupted, not completed. The line in the record book reads like a sentence cut off mid-thought, the kind that makes you wait for words that never come. That is the great pivot of this entire story. The career was over before Martin turned 31.
What remained was not the man's playing days, but everything that those days had planted. The memory, the meaning, the unanswerable question of what might have been. A prime cut short, a record that would forever read, "What if?" But Buffalo was not finished with Rick Martin, not by a long shot, because a city that loses a star young tends to remember him forever. Long after Rick Martin stopped playing, his name kept showing up in the Buffalo Sabres record book, again and again, as if refusing to leave. He holds the franchise career records for hat tricks, for 4-goal games, for 40-goal seasons, for consecutive 40-goal seasons, for 50-goal seasons, a mark he shares with Danny Gare,
and for consecutive 50-goal seasons.
Read that list slowly. It is not the resume of a complimentary player or a one-year wonder. It is the fingerprint of a man who scored in bunches, year after year, at a rate few in franchise history have ever matched. And his footprint reaches beyond Buffalo, into the national record. Martin recorded 21 career hat tricks, which stands 14th all-time in NHL history. His goals per game rate places him among the most prolific goal scorers by that measure in NHL history. These are not small distinctions. They are the kind of numbers that, in most cases, lead to a particular phone call. But here, we have to be careful and honest. Despite a career that placed him among the era's elite goal scorers, Rick Martin never received a call from the Hockey Hall of Fame. That is a matter of public record. Simply stated, he is not enshrined in hockey's most exclusive hall. We will not pretend to know the deliberations behind that. We'll not call it a snub or claim his case was formally weighed and rejected, because that is not something the record tells us. What the record does tell us is the plain fact of the absence. A man with this kind of scoring resume, this collection of franchise marks, this national ranking, is not among the names on those walls in Toronto. And there is a quiet logic to part of it. The career was short. The prime was stolen. The longevity that often pads a Hall of Fame argument was taken from him on a November night in 1980. The very injury that ended his career also shrank the body of work that institutions like to measure. And yet, the trophies and the silence tell only half the story. To Buffalo, Rick Martin was never just a stat line. He was family. And the city was about to prove it in bronze and banners. If the National Record Book kept Rick Martin at arm's length, Buffalo pulled him close and never let go. The honors began arriving while he was still a relatively young man. In 1989, Martin was inducted into the Buffalo Sabres Hall of Fame, and he did not go in alone. He went in alongside the two line mates whose names will forever be spoken in the same breath as his, Gilbert Perreault and René Robert. The trio that had terrified the league entered the team's hall together, exactly as they had played. Then came the moment that fixed his number in the rafters forever. On the 15th of November, 1995, the Sabres retired Martin's number 7. They raised it alongside René Robert's number 14, and the two banners were hung to flank the number 11 of Gilbert Perreault. Picture that arrangement, deliberate and tender. The two wingers on either side, the center between them, joined in the rafters the way they had been joined on the ice. The team did not just retire 3 numbers. They reassembled the line, permanently, above the place where they had once made magic. The tributes kept coming as the decades passed. In 2010, marking the franchise's 40th season, the Buffalo News ranked Martin 4th among the top 40 Sabres of all time. The fans, voting separately, placed him 5th. 4 decades after he arrived as an unproven kid from the junior ranks, the city still counted him among the most important players ever to wear the crest. That is not nostalgia fading with time. That is a place in the permanent memory of a hockey town. And Buffalo would go further still, casting the legend in something more lasting than paint and banner cloth. In 2012, a bronze monument rose outside the arena, now known as KeyBank Center. It captured all 3 men of that famous line in motion, frozen in the moment they were most feared. A city does not commission a statue for a man it merely admired. It does so for a man it loved. But while Buffalo was busy turning memory into metal, Rick Martin himself had long since moved on to something quieter and, in its own way, just as impressive. He had built a second life. After the skates came off, Martin and his wife Mikey ran 2 companies in Williamsville, New York, a business called Global Quest Solutions and a related staffing firm. He was not chasing the spotlight, not clinging to old glory in a broadcast booth or a coaching chair.
He was an entrepreneur, a working man in Western New York, doing the unglamorous, steady labor of building something with his name on the door. And at the center of it all was family. Rick and Mikey raised 3 sons together: Corey, Josh, and Eric. Picture that ordinary, hard-won contentment. The deadly sniper of the 1970s had become a husband, a father, a businessman whose days were filled with payroll and dinner tables and the small rhythms of a normal life. The man who shot once terrified goaltenders was, by all appearances, simply a productive, grounded member of his community.
There is a kind of grace in that. The legend who did not need to keep being a legend every single day. That is what makes what came next so jarring. On the 13th of March, 2011, Rick Martin passed away in Clarence, New York. He suffered a heart attack while driving, a complication of hypertensive arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease. He was just 59 years old. There was no long illness in the public eye, no slow goodbye. One day he was there, building, living, fathering, and the next, he was gone. His passing stunned the city. But in the weeks that followed, a decision made by his grieving widow would turn a private tragedy into a discovery that shook all of professional hockey. In the rawest stretch of her grief, Mikey Martin made a choice that almost no one would think to make. She agreed to let her late husband's brain be studied. The request came through Chris Nowinski of the Sports Legacy Institute, who tracked her down in the difficult days after Rick's passing. And her reasoning, as she expressed it, was rooted entirely in the kind of man she had married. Rick, she said, would have wanted people to learn from him. If other hockey players could be made safer by studying his brain, then he would have been all for it. Think about what that decision asked of her.
To take the most private, the most personal piece of the man she had just lost and hand it over to science, in the hope that strangers in lab coats might find something useful inside it. It was an act of extraordinary generosity at the worst possible moment. The kind of selflessness that turns one family's loss into a gift for everyone who plays the game. The brain went to researchers at Boston University, to a center that had already become central to one of the most unsettling stories in modern sports. This was the same group that had examined the brains of departed players and found a pattern, a degenerative condition tied to repeated blows to the head. They had confirmed it in men like Bob Probert and Reggie Fleming, names that hockey fans of a certain age know well, names attached to a very particular role on the ice. These were fighters, enforcers, men whose jobs involved trading punches, absorbing impact after impact as a matter of professional duty. So as the analysis began, there was a quiet expectation built into the science. The disease they were hunting for had, until then, shown up in the brains of the men who fought. Rick Martin was not one of those men. He was a scorer, a finisher, an artist with the puck, not a brawler. The question hanging over the laboratory was simple, and in hindsight, enormous. What would they find in a man who had never made his living with his fists? Because when the results came back, the doctors did not just find a disease. They found a finding so alarming, it forced the entire sport to ask a terrifying new question. The results, when they arrived in the autumn of 2011, landed like a thunderclap across the hockey world. Rick Martin had chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, the degenerative brain disease that, in the NHL players studied up to that point, had been found only in fighters and enforcers. And among the players that Boston University Center had examined at the time, Martin was the first who had not played an enforcer role, the first who had not regularly fought on the ice. The sniper, the scorer, the artist carried the same disease as the brawlers. That distinction is everything,
And it is why the news traveled so far, so fast. Neurosurgeon Robert Cantu called the findings alarming, and his reasoning cut straight to the fear underneath the whole story. Martin appeared to have suffered perhaps only one concussion in his entire career, the violent one back in 1978, and it had nothing to do with fighting. If a man who scored goals for a living, who rarely, if ever, dropped the gloves, could end up with this disease, then the danger was not confined to the game's designated tough guys. It potentially reached everyone who laced up. But the science demanded care, and the researchers gave it.
Dr. Ann McKee was careful not to pin the entire condition on that single 1978 hit. She pointed out that Martin had played without a helmet for most of his years on the ice, which meant that any blow to the head over all that time may have been a contributing factor. In other words, the famous concussion was likely one piece among many, not the lone cause. A whole career of unprotected impacts, the ordinary collisions no one bothered to count, had quietly added up. And then there was the most human nuance of all, the part that made Martin's case both reassuring and deeply sad. His disease was relatively mild. It was classified as stage 2 at age 59, when most cases the center had studied by that age had already advanced to stage 3 or 4. Researchers suggested he may have been unusually resilient. And notably, Martin had passed away without showing the symptoms so often associated with the condition: the failing memory, the dark moods, the cognitive trouble. By the accounts available, he simply did not display those struggles in any significant way. He had the disease in his brain, but he had lived his second life as himself, building his business, raising his sons, right to the end. And so the story of Rick Martin ends not as a simple hockey tragedy, but as a warning. A quiet sniper from Buffalo who, even in passing, may have helped change how the world thinks about the game he loved. Let us return, finally, to that number 7 painted behind every net in the spring of 2011, the image where this story began. By now, it should make a different kind of sense. It was never really about a stat line. It was a city telling itself and telling anyone who would look that this man mattered more than the cold arithmetic could ever capture. Consider what the record book actually holds. A career frozen at 384 goals and 701 points across 685 games. A prime that produced more than 50 goals in a single shortened season. A man who never lifted the Stanley Cup and who never received a call from the Hockey Hall of Fame. On paper, it reads like a very good career that stopped just short of the very top. And that is precisely the ache that defines it. The body of work was cut down before it could grow into what it was clearly becoming, broken on a November breakaway when its owner was still in his prime. That is the heart of why Rick Martin feels larger in Buffalo than he does in the national ledger. The country measures completed careers, full resumes, the long accumulation that earns enshrinement. Buffalo measured something else. It measured what it felt to watch him at full power, what it felt to believe the window was wide open in 1975, and what it felt to lose all of that far too soon. A community took a career the national record considered incomplete and made it whole in its own way, with banners reassembling his line in the rafters, with bronze outside the arena, with a place near the very top of every list the city ever made. And then there is the final, unexpected legacy, the one no one could have scripted. In agreeing to let his brain be studied, Martin and his family handed the sport a piece of knowledge it could not ignore, a finding that pushed the conversation about head injuries beyond the men who fought and toward everyone who plays. The deadly finisher became, in the end, a kind of pioneer in a battle no athlete ever wants to join. A Stanley Cup he never lifted, a Hall of Fame call that never came, a prime stolen on home ice
And yet, decades on, in a hockey town that refuses to forget, Rick Martin remains exactly what he always was. The sniper of a line they still talk about, the star Buffalo loved, and the man whose final gift reached far beyond the game he gave his body to.